Join us as we go exploring the world of Pokemon. Today's story, The Poison Climber. As we venture back into the wilds of Hisui, we learn so much of the ancient past. However, one thing that was interesting about Hisui itself is that there are so many Pokemon that were so unique to it. It has spurred a new theory, but that will be explained a little bit later. As we venture to the area known as the Coronet Highlands, which eventually wraps around to the Alabaster Icelands, we find a specific Pokemon here. One that's so elusive that for the most part, many people believe that its existence has been left into the ancient past. As we venture to the highest points and parts of the Crimson or the Coronet Highlands, we learn a lot of the area, as very different than something like the Crimson Mirelands. You see that the environment is very difficult, as unlike most of the other areas of Hisui that were somewhat barren or difficult because of Pokemon, the Coronet Highlands is more difficult because of its terrain. As sheep and shark cliffs basically dominate the area, with massive waterfalls to certain areas. Pokemon that have specific abilities to adapt here usually have to focus on being specially adapted to their areas. But this isn't the case for one, as we have to look at one of the more interesting residents of the area, that being Hisuian Sneasel. As Hisuian Sneasel is a Pokemon that for the most part was abandoned in terms of the original search, as it was believed that there was another theory based that could explain where Hisuian Sneasel went. But when we began to look more into the ancient Pokedex, there was another entry of a Pokemon that we had never seen before. And as its rumors of climbing the famous Coronet Highlands was here, we find ourselves to the Pokemon in question, Sneasler. As Sneasler's dex entry reads as follows: because of Sneasler's virulent poison and daunting physical prowess, no other species could hope to best it on the frozen highlands. Preferring solitude, this species does not form packs. Already from that description, Sneasler was somewhat of an oddity, as when looking into some of the historical areas of the Hisui region, it's clear that this Pokemon was still important, as it was one of the noble Pokemon. But it was very hard to find, as even the researchers who took into some case looking into Sneasler's past, it was very hard to find this Pokemon, as it makes itself very scant. And for those who were lucky to own one via the evolution of, say, Hisuian Sneasel, they were very surprised as this Pokemon's abilities. But we would wonder, why would this Pokemon? What did it do? And why was it so important that it was actually a noble Pokemon? As we look into the area of the Coronet Highlands, one thing is clear. There was lots of darkness shrouded around it, as due to the ability of having caves as well, and the networks that line up many Pokemon of the Coronet Highlands, believe it or not, still somewhat exist in Hisui as a whole, as many are able to look out and find them. Pokemon such as Gligar and Pokemon very much like Gabite and Gibble make their way still in the Sinnoh region. And along with them was the Pokemon of the pre-evolution in question, Hisuian Sneasel. As Hisuian Sneasel's dex entry reads as follows: its sturdy curved claws are ideal for traversing precipitous cliffs. From the tips of these claws drips a venom that infiltrates the nervous of any prey caught in Sneasel's grasp. As one thing was obvious, Sneasel, specifically Hisuian Sneasel, was somewhat oddly adapted for the region and the area it was found in, as it did share its reigning area with many Pokemon that were not weak to poison at all. And although it was able to climb somewhat well, this made us wonder, why on earth was this Pokemon able to exist in this region and area and be so well known? As it was clear from the evolution explanations that we would see that Hisuian Sneasel would actually evolve during the day, as some specific researchers were able to witness this, as very much like their counterparts from Johto, by holding the Razor Claw. However, during the day, the Hisuian Sneasels could evolve, and that's how they would become their evolved form, Sneasler. Sneasler's height and weight, as well as body shape, made many wonder what on earth could this benefit in the area where many Pokemon had either thicker, heavier bodies, more iron robust strength, and the ability of flight. How could Sneasler's abilities help it out? But this was witnessed when a researcher of the ancient past watched an interesting situation, as a more adept Gabite came into conflict with a Sneasler. As the Sneasler was preparing, the Gabite charged in, as many do still in the modern day. But to the surprise of the researcher, they would watch something they never expected. As the Gabite charged in, the Sneasler leaped head over heels and delivered a blow to the head of the Gabite as it crossed by. As the Gabite crashed into the ground, it was clear that Sneasler traded a lot of additional strength for flexibility of movement, something that was somewhat odd considering of its location in the highlands. How could it be using this agility and speed when there's so many cliffs and areas? As it was also mentioned from the same researcher, they would watch as a Steelix actually appeared and was chasing a Sneasler. Even with the addition of its fighting and poison typing, a Steelix is no joke. And as it continued to chase the Sneasler away, they would watch something astounding. As the Sneasler reached a cliff, it seemed that the Steelix had actually caught it, and unsure of what was going to happen, they believed that the Steelix was going to crush the Sneasler, but to their surprise, it didn't. As Sneasler did something shocking, using its very sharp curved claws, it dug into the mountain, and with lightning fast speed, it pulled itself up, and it continued to climb until the Steelix could not reach it. As the Steelix looked in confusion, it would have to look up as the Sneasler reached another point that was nearly completely vertical, and unfortunately for the Steelix, there was no way it was going to follow up and capture that Sneasler. But this also explained a lot, as Sneasler was one of the noble Pokemon, but also famously known as one of the very few ride Pokemon of Hisui that allowed people to, funny enough, be carried in a pack on its back where it was tied to it, as this was actually drawn by researchers and talked about as one of the more interesting parts of the history of Hisui. Remember to join the race to 250 subs and join the surge, guys. Back to your regular scheduled programming. But this also then begged the question, how could Sneasler disappear? And, more importantly, why would it leave Hisui, as this Pokemon that clearly showed why it was pretty decently adapted to take advantage of areas that the other Pokemon could not? What led to the decline? For a good amount of time after this research was made known, scientists and Pokemon researchers dug deep into explaining what happened to Hisuian Sneasel and Sneasler. As one thing that was clear, that these Pokemon, although not necessarily well to adapted to other climates or not known of, didn't seem like they would have to matter with the massive climate change that would have taken place in Hisui soon, as well as the fact that their typing, although being somewhat different, should have given them an advantage over the terrain and some of the Pokemon that still exist in the area that would have been the Cornell Highlands in the modern day, still exist there today. So that always makes the question harder, how on earth could they vanish? One specific belief was they didn't vanish, as due to the presence of Sneasel and Weavile, it was believed for some time that maybe the population of the Hisuian Sneasel and Sneaslers eventually readapted and became these variant Pokemon, and became the Sneasel and the Weavile we know today. However, we're unable to make that, this was unable to be cleared, as the disposition and typing just didn't make sense, especially with the overlapping area in terms of the way that they live, as many scientists gave the hypothesis that it was pretty easy to assume that this meant that the evolution could have occurred in the other way, as we know the Sneasels of Johto evolve by having the Razor Claw held during nighttime. It was believed that maybe the Hisuian Sneasel could do the same, and maybe over time they just chose not to be poison and fighting types anymore. But that was made false, as it just did not make genetic sense, but also it didn't make sense in terms of explaining why Sneasler wouldn't appear if a Sneasel of the Sinnoh region was given a razor claw during the day, as this evolution path must have still been available if they weren't. But with the Pokédex entry we found, this was easily explained in a way that surprised us. As it reads as follows: this Pokemon shares roots with the Sneasel of Hisui, but unlike that species, this one is spiteful in personality. I hypothesize that water and earth can affect Sneasel's mind and body. As one hypothesis that is still up in debate today is the use of the explanation that many believe that the space-time distortions that are mentioned in various Pokédexes are the reason we do not have these Pokemon, as in the case of the Pokemon in case of Sneasel is listed inside the Coronet Highlands that the Sneasels did not appear there. However, they did appear in what is known as the Obsidian Fieldlands and the space-time distortions, which is somewhat strange. But what's more strange is the fact that the space-time distortions said to have brought the Johto Sneasels here, as the reference to calling them Johto or Johtonian Sneasels is made as a clear distinction as by the explanation and some of the recovered specimens of the Hisuian Sneasel. At least they were genetically different enough to be their own separate species, but similar enough to where both were Sneasels, but not vice versa for their evolutions. As it was seemingly obvious that the Sneasels that were brought in from wherever tended to take over, as the Johtonian Sneasels that do exist into the modern day of Sinnoh are very prevalent and actually very famous in Sinnoh, as many people and trainers like to use them. And this must have brought some competition to the Hisuian Sneasel, as obviously they do have different mentalities and way of behavior. As we can look at even the comparison to their evolved forms in Sneasler and Weavile, as both act very differently and treat their evolution paths in different ways. As one of the more interesting behaviors is that unlike Sneasler that likes to be alone, Weavile likes to work together in groups with groups of Sneasels, usually leading as a pack leader. And these form little groups, gangs, troops, whatever you like to call them, they form together, as this is a different evolution or focused species path and a strange social behavior only done by Weavile. As it reads in its text, this species corners prey as a pack, under the guidance of a leader. Weavile displays increased in cunning, leading me to speculate that its evolution caused further brain development. And from other dex entries that follow the study of the Johtonian Sneasel in the Hisui region, it was clear that this pack strategy was very effective, as by being a non-solitary predator, these Pokemon were able to gather around prey and take down Pokemon that, for the most part, they shouldn't have been able to. One advantage they had that after certain times as they began to appear in the Coronet Highlands themselves was the fact of the ice and dark typing, which was very effective against the flying, rock, dragon, and dark and ground types that plague the area. And with Weavile's additional intelligence, it doesn't fight blindly, usually using its brain to corner opponents and catch prey. One of the other advantages that we find is the evolution at night, as by having Sneasels evolve at night with razor claws, this allows them a better chance at survival and distribution of their packs, as because Weavile evolving at night, most Pokemon don't tend to necessarily be nocturnal, but this gives them an ability and an advantage. By getting stronger and more dangerous at night, other Pokemon may suffer and be defeated by them. As we begin to see another special ability that we're unsure if it is true, but would make a lot of sense, was the amalgamation and the combination of the Hisuian Sneasels joining in with the Johtonian Sneasels. Now, this is not necessarily something new to the Pokemon world, where we have something known as egg groups that allow Pokemon to essentially mate to create Pokemon eggs in their own ways, that meaning not necessarily have to be related to each other, but in the case of these two, because they're similar enough, they are able to do that, which also means that there is a possibility that they were able to coexist and interact, as it was believed that certain Hisuian Sneasels started to join groups of Johtonian Sneasels, seeing the advantage of the group packing behavior, and due to this, It seemed that they chose not to evolve at all, meaning that the lack of these species as they began to evolve and effectively breed out, being Hisuian Sneasel and focusing more on Chitonian Sneasel, they may have bred out their evolution line, effectively leaving Sneaslers alone. But this is a simple idea. There's no guarantee of the concrete of this situation. But this leads us to where we must believe that this could have been multiple contributing factors, as one thing that was also a contributing factor to the disappearance of Sneasler was the climate. Now, this is a stranger combination than most of the other Pokemon, as Sneasler's disappearance was not necessarily correlated with the receding ice that took place during the end of the Hisuian period where it became warmer, but it did have an impact, as we know that Hisuian Sneasel really did enjoy the ice areas where they were found in the Alabaster Icelands. So it leaves us wondering where they went. But then it brings us finally to what we believe is a new theory we are proposing, which is the Hisuian flight. Now, Hisuian flight is a very new theory. Very new, in fact. We're probably the first ones to put this out, but Hisuian flight is effectively our way of explaining what happened to most of the Hisuian Pokemon, as so far we have done multiple entries. It's not too difficult to believe that the Hisuian flight took place. For a Pokemon like Ursaluna that we've mentioned in our other entries before, as well as Basque Legion, these Pokemon seem to have left the region, but they can still be found in the modern day, which leads us to believe that most of the Hisuian Pokemon, whether they were taken by force in terms of being with trainers or being captured by maybe poachers and dragged along somewhere else, they were moved out of Hisui, and essentially during the time of the last end of our major ice period for Hisui, we see the Pokemon disappear, and it changes into almost what would happen with the modern day Sinnoh region. As we can see, we have even instances in places like the Paldea region where trainers do have Sneasel and they have access to Sneasler in the form of their Hisuian forms. Although it's not exactly clear where this population is coming from, it is expected that by trainers having them and using them in competition means that the Pokemon isn't completely extinct. And it still leads us up in the air of this existence of the Pokemon. But unfortunately, we do know by today's standards, this Pokemon is completely gone from Hisui as a whole. And now we have it missing. However, because it is existing in other regions, there's a chance we'll find it once again. This has been the tale of the Poison Climber. And as always, this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off. And for all of you out there, to sign on.